Our next presenter has kindly agreed to move his presentation to earlier. So without further ado, Erik is going to be doing a presentation about Myst in libraries and libraries in Myst.
Thank you. I realized the moment I fell into my presentation that I had not rehearsed with a mask as I had planned. I continued falling into a Bane impression of which I could only make out a few fleeting words. But now, I am Erik Oberg. I'm a librarian with the Omaha Public Library in Omaha, Nebraska. The bulk of what I'm going to be talking about is really more just libraries in Myst, but they do actually kind of go together. I'm going to do the stereotypical thing, and I'm going to start out with a definition just to give us an idea of what we're talking about, because the definition of libraries has grown, changed, and evolved quite a lot across history, and there are actually numerous definitions. The one I'm pulling from is quite long. I've just pulled a brief little snippet and then cut that snippet into tinier pieces to kind of match what we're talking about specifically in terms of Myst. But it tells us that libraries are collections of resources made accessible in a room, a building, a virtual space, some combination thereof. Library collections take their form in an increasing variety of formats and range in sizes from a few items to thousands of items. They may not necessarily all be books. They may not necessarily be books at all. History has also shown us the evolution of what library types there are, from public libraries, institutional libraries, private libraries, corporate libraries. Some we'll see more than others in this presentation. So now that we have an idea of what can be a library, let's get to Myst, which begins with a library. Really, in a certain timeline, which I think technically was supposed to be maybe canon at one point. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, because I think I might be. Myst literally begins in a library. If you don't know what that building is, that is the San Francisco Public Library, and Myst trivia buffs might already know where I'm going with this. They'll recall that the original Prima hint guide for Myst was oddly written sort of like a first-person journal, and it started with these words. So I'll start at my beginning. I won't bore you with personal backstory. What's more to the point is how I got on this dock. One moment, I'm a guy in the San Francisco Public Library, deep in the stacks, digging for books on photography. Next thing I know, I'm wandering a mythical island. Now, one thing that has always kind of rubbed me the wrong way about this is that it seems to make the stranger specifically male, which I never liked. I definitely don't like it now. But at the same time, what I thought was just really interesting about this was that we have this library that we can get to by going inside a book that we find inside another library in a narrative that we can read about in this book, a book which in turn, if we really wanted to, only 9 miles away, we could go check it out from a library. If WorldCat is to be believed, there is a school library about 9 miles away that has a copy of the original hint guide, and I believe 30 miles away it says that there's another public library where if we really wanted to, we could go check out this original guide, which I didn't bother to verify because I didn't want to have my hopes dashed, but I just liked the idea that we're at Mysterium, and if we really wanted to, we could just go a short distance to a library, check out this book, read about going to that library, and finding that book, going inside it to get to that library. I just thought it was cool. I don't know if it's fractal books or fractal libraries or what, but it was just a neat idea. But let's get to the real meat and talk about how libraries fit into the Myst universe. Now, the obvious place to start is the Myst library, and I quickly started to make connections to the real-world library where I work. So we're going to think about Myst library in that sense, Myst library as a library, because when you think about it, it kind of is. Myst library is centrally located, as a good library ought to be. Myst library features a book collection, obviously. Myst library features art and interactive multimedia. This is an art installation that was at the library where I work, and the artist did indeed barrel in a bunch of dirt directly onto the carpet. And fortunately, the artist got to clean that up, not me. But I liked the installation. It seemed like something you might see in a Myst game, which I thought was cool. But elsewhere, the Myst library features spaces for video telecommunication. It features tech hardware with a flat screen interface. It has facilities for climate control on a cold or rainy day. Probably wouldn't do much good on a hot day like today, but it's there. Myst library features an upper level with a great view. These are respectively the east and west views from the top floor of the library where I work, looking at parts of downtown Omaha. And the Myst library is close to transportation infrastructure. Libraries, especially in cities, like being close to bus stops, transit stations, any kind of mass public transit to make it easier for people to access the library. And lastly, Myst Library is appropriate in size relative to the service area. Now, the inside of the library, it feels like a really small building, but relative to the size of its service area, this tiny little island, it's actually kind of huge. There's a whole science behind how big a library should or shouldn't be, and I won't bore you with the technical details, but the top right is a photo of the Scott County Library System's LeClaire branch. That's the tiny little library that I used to go to when I was very, very small myself. That library sadly no longer exists, but the population has grown. When that photo was taken, I think they were at about 2,700 people. The city's grown a little bit, so they have a newer, bigger library. But beneath that is the Omaha Public Library's main downtown branch. That's the library where I work, at least for another month or so until it gets torn down, sadly. But it is, right now, the main library for the Omaha Public Library System, serving a service population of almost 100,000 people. There are 11 other branches in the system, so not everybody has to go there. But for now, it's the main branch. For now. So moving on, elsewhere in Myst, I had to start to think about how I was going to look at this because I recalled, I don't think that there are any libraries or real big collections of books in Riven or Exile and so on. And so what I decided to do was to take an approach where I would look for any time I could find more than one book in a single frame together at the same time. And I think that served me well, at least initially, because I found that in Riven, looking at it in terms of books and libraries, it's kind of defined by a sparseness of books. You are the library in this game. In fact, my initial thought was that in Riven, you're carrying more books on your person than you do at any other point in the series. Now, I later had to walk that back, but that was just how my mind immediately remembered it. But elsewhere, in the top left, these books here that are kind of next to each other on a proper shelf, that's really the only place where I could find books arranged like that in the entire game. And at any point, not during the presentation, but at any point, if you spot something where I'm wrong or if I miss something, feel free to correct me. But that's the only point in Riven where I could find a shelf with books just kind of stacked next to each other. And I'm pretty sure those are blank as well. And beneath that, Atris has the Myst and Riven linking books, and I've looked around Riven and Myst and Kavir to see if I could find other books, and I don't think there are any other books there, at least none that we can see. Again, I might be wrong. And after I got those three images, I moved on, but then I had to go back because I remembered, oh right, there's another point in Riven when you can see multiple books together at once. And my mind almost registered them more as transportation infrastructure than as books, which is why I think I kind of glossed over them. But there they are. They are obviously curated with intent and purpose in their collection, like a library. There's actually another book on that table behind them that you can't really see very well in the image, but it's there, and it is a collection of books. Now, Exile, I found that libraries are private or lost. Up there in Atris's study, this is probably the best example of a library we have so far. Of course, we can't access it, and we only see it very briefly at the beginning of the game. And then elsewhere, I remembered at the end, yes, there is a brief period where you are carrying 3 books on your person, even if you can only access 2 of them. But let's look at this mural that Saavedra has painted for us, because you'll notice that he took the time to paint piles of books at the feet of Circe and Akinar. Now, I don't know what these books are. I don't know if these are books that Circe and Akinar or Atris brought there. I like to think that maybe Narayan had a nice, thriving book culture, but we don't know. At any rate, Saavedra did take the time to paint them. But I found that, like I had anticipated, I was finding there's not a whole lot to work with in terms of collections of books. Even here in Exile, a bunch of the books that we can see are painted. They're not even actual books. And of course, all of this changes when you get to Revelation. This is a game where I found that libraries are personal and have a high degree of practical circulation. That's sort of a technical jargony way of saying they get used a lot. But in terms of them being personal, I imagine that a lot, maybe most or even all of the books on the shelf in the bedroom belong to Catherine. Misha, of course, has her own bookshelf in her room. Atris naturally has a library in his laboratory and elsewhere in his study. But that approach that I had about just trying to find any time I could see more than one book together at once, I had to rethink that and think a little bit more deeply, because here books are all over the place. So I had, like I said, I had to think a little bit more deeply at this point. I don't think this is a library. More than one book, yeah, but I think these are maybe books that could have been pulled from a library together, but I have no way of knowing if they're connected to each other or not. They're just books that have been pulled from a library. Now this is obviously a library, of course. This may be a little bit of a gray area. These books seem like they're not the most organized, but they are in Atris Study, so yeah, it's probably not a stretch to think they're part of the overall library in Atris Study. These three books, this is not a library. They might be part of that overall library in Atris Study, but the three books just laying out on the desk, not a library. Now, the question that I thought was the most fascinating for Revelation, is this a library? Because once again, I sort of glossed over it because in my mind, I was just seeing transportation, almost like a fork in a hallway, rather than a collection of books. But that's what they are, once again. They're obviously curated with intent and purpose. In fact, they almost look like they have more intent and carefulness put into their display than at any other point. Now, I'm not going to give you an answer as to whether this is a library, just something I want you to think about for now. Now, moving on to End of Ages, playing the game with this focus on books and libraries made the game feel a lot like Riven, and not just because there's a D'ni descendant with a god complex, because here, once again, libraries are absent or empty like they were in Riven, and once again, you are the library. In fact, if you play the game properly, you don't even go to the library, and if you do, it's completely empty. Now, going to what I was talking about earlier with the books that you carry on your person, this is where I really had to walk things back because I had initially, just from memory, kind of dismissed End of Ages because one book is basically just like a collection of save images. The other one is your personal journal, which you may or may not use, so there might not even be anything in it. And Yisha's writings seem almost more like scraps of paper, but when you look at them, they are all bound. They do all have pages in them, so yeah, those are all books. And going by how I've been thinking about it, it is actually End of Ages, despite the large absence of books in libraries where you're carrying more books on your person in this game than at any other point. If I'm wrong, somebody do correct me afterward. But also, again, with End of Ages, the question that I thought was the most fascinating, is this a library? Now, it was kind of difficult to get a shot where I could see multiple books in the same image and be able to tell that you're looking at multiple books, but there are multiple books there, and going off this big, broad picture definition, I don't know that it's a stretch to count the slates. But yeah, once again, it's a collection of books. They're curated with intent, purpose for a specific community. I kind of lean into thinking that, yeah, this is a library. Now, at this point, those of you who are really into all the games in the Myst universe are probably thinking, hold on a second, Erik, you've skipped over something pretty big. Don't worry, we're going to get there. But before we do, let's go back to that definition, because we've been talking really big, broad picture about what libraries can be. So let's reel it back into how we tend to think of libraries, especially as institutions, especially public libraries like the kind where I work in. And elsewhere, this gives us an idea of what those libraries are like, and it tells us that these are places intended for people who choose not to or can't afford to purchase extensive collections or need material no individual can reasonably be expected to own alone, or who need professional assistance from librarians. Now, crucially, these places also provide spaces for quietness, spaces for collaboration, for community, and all with a focus on information access and commonality. Just keep that in the back of your mind as we go into Uru, because as I said, we're bringing it back into how we tend to think of libraries, because here, libraries are libraries. Playing Uru and thinking about libraries and books made the game really, really fun, but it also took a game that has a lot of real tragedy in its backstory and made it feel even more sad, because these libraries are abandoned relics. Not only are there history haunted by millennia of books, and I can't remember how many kings there are and everything beyond the kings, but there are also collections whose loss of ownership is so recent that the loss feels almost more visceral and tangible than in the other games, even the games that I just played through before. Like in Myst, there were lots of burned books on the shelf, which is sad, but now the shelf is almost completely empty. So it got me thinking, I want to learn more about what libraries were like for the D'ni. And I like that there is still dynamism in these libraries, like libraries are still being added to Uru, but as the D'ni experienced it, there was an interesting dynamism, because this is fascinating. This is just like what I work with at the library where I work. I can't automatically pull up physical books from my library catalog, but I can immediately automatically pull up ebooks from the catalog, just as this does. This is a library and a library catalog all in one. In fact, some libraries, mostly academic libraries, have automatic retrieval systems that can automatically pull up a physical book at the touch of a button. This is just like what I work with, and I thought that was so neat. Because, as I said, these are proper libraries now, which, again, made it all the more sad, because we have this great library that we can barely access, And then there's the common library in D'ni City, which we can't access at all. And even if I could access it, the people of D'ni for whom it was made wouldn't be there to share it with me. And we do know that it does have a rich history. We know about King Eilish wanting to make sure that the people had a great library before he even had his own palace. We know about King Kedri, who wanted to make sure that not only did the people have a decent library or an adequate library, but a truly remarkable library that reflected the grandeur of the D'ni people back to the people of D'ni. And I thought that was wonderful. And yet, again, sad that I can't see it. So in wanting to learn more about libraries, this is where Larry, who I believe does the cavern tours, came in handy. He was very gracious and let me use some screenshots and information from his website. And he helped me put together a little bullet list of the types of libraries that you would encounter in D'ni. So we have the private linking book libraries that were held by the upper class. There are small communal linking book libraries, such as those found in community neighborhoods. There's one that's written about in one of the journals of the kings. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. There are public parks with small collections, Durebo, an example. There are the larger themed libraries like the Museum and the Great Library on Agura. And then there's the Common Library in D'ni City, which would have been the only public library that you could access if you were of the lower classes and you couldn't get to Agura. And being a public librarian who values being a library and providing service, providing information, community, just the basic necessities of learning to everyone and anyone who comes inside, it sort of rubbed me the wrong way. And I started to think about books, libraries, and Myst in terms of other things that are important to me personally. And I started thinking about them in terms of justice and injustice. I remembered that in the books, Veovis was originally meant to be beheaded on the steps of the library. That also kind of rubbed me the wrong way. I mean, some people might have seen that as justice. It seemed a bit like injustice to me. And I also noticed something else that cropped up, a surprising amount in the Myst universe. And this is where we have to take a little bit more of a dark turn in the presentation and talk about book burning. Because it's something that happens a fair amount here, isn't it? Even before the extensive, or even beyond the extensive book burning done by Circe and Achener before the story even begins for us, in Myst, Atris himself burns books. In Riven, we see, hear, and read about systemic burning of books. In fact, Riven does something really, really fascinating that I don't think I've seen done anywhere else. Riven shows us a book burning from the perspective of the book. I don't think I've ever seen that done before or after anywhere else. And it just sort of blew my mind. In Exile, we see the consequences of serial book burners. We know that this book is burned. We don't actually see it get burned in the game, but we do see the flames steadily creeping towards it right before we jump in, and we know that it was destroyed after we followed Saavedro, and it's probably not too unlikely that other books were destroyed in that fire. And let's go back to that mural for a second, because again, Saavedro took the time to paint these books at their feet. And we know that they burned linking books in front of Saavedro, and we know that they burned lots of books extensively throughout the ages. So I don't know if those books still exist or not. I like to think maybe they were still there on the other side of the shield, but we don't know. For all we know, those books could well have been burned. Now elsewhere, in Revelation and End of Ages, we get a little bit of a reprieve from book burning, although even then, Atris talks about intentionally destroying books. And when we get to elsewhere in D'ni history, in the books and in Uru, we read about things like King Shamat. Very early in D'ni history, only the third king, if I remember correctly, already giving a dark foreshadowing mirror of Atris' own actions later on, as he lures members of his own family into a book and then burns that book. And then elsewhere in D'ni history, we read about books that are destroyed systemically in furnaces for being improper or unusable or broken. Although at that point, I had to think a little bit more deeply about what was going on, because I started to wonder, wait a minute, is this all that different from what I do? Because I work in a library, and I have taken knives to books, cut them up. I have destroyed books. I have taken books that I've destroyed, made crafts out of them. I've recycled books. I've taken books that are made of material that can't be recycled, which is more books than you might think, and tossed them in a dumpster. Is that really all that different from burning a book? Practically speaking, I'm not sure that it is. So again, I had to think a little bit more deeply about this. In fact, think about it. The very first things that we hear as players of Myst I realized the moment I fell into the fissure that the book would not be destroyed as I had planned. It seems like there's something else going on here. So, recall what I said earlier about conceptually mixing up linking books with infrastructure, because here they are infrastructure, they're equipment, they're tools, they're a means of transportation from one place to another. Now, in an abstract sense, books in our real world are the same, but here, that is literally what they are. So, in light of that, is what Atris does in the D'ni more akin to the sort of stereotypical images we have of Nazis burning books in Germany? Is it more akin to that, or is it more akin to, say, filling in a dangerous sinkhole or disarming a landmine? And after thinking, I thought, you know what, maybe it is a little bit more like the latter, because Atris is somebody who has to take book burning very seriously. We read in the Book of D'ni, I remembered, when they find the linking book for Tirani, Atris says something that's kind of unthinkable. He says, "But I shall burn no book without good cause." Now, it sort of makes sense in the context of the book, but if we take it out of context, put it in a newspaper headline or a newsreel, it sounds unthinkable. It should just be, "I shall burn no book, period." But no, he says, "I shall burn no book without good cause." And again, Atris is somebody who has to take book burning very seriously, especially in light of what he had been through shortly before he said that. So the last thing that I thought of when I was thinking about book burning in this subject, I had to go back to Riven, because not only does Riven give us that just wild perspective of the book during a book burning, it also shows us something else. It shows us a community finding a true lifeline, in every sense of the word, being created from the ashes of an attempted book burning. And I'm glad that I thought of this last, because it gave me like a real emotional reprieve to think about just how beautiful it is that these people were able to create something wonderful and life-saving in an act of defiance against oppression, against book burning, against, well, having their very lives threatened. And I thought that was just really, really wonderful. So is all of this to say that book burning is okay, or at least not a big deal? No. But in exploring the topic through the lens of Myst, it helps us reframe the issue for us, to help us look past just the physical thing and stop focusing on the overt sensational violence of burning books, and look more at the intent, thinking about who is burning or destroying a book and why. Because I'm going to give you some wisdom that I and many of my colleagues have come across that can be a little jarring to think about at first, and that is that books are not sacred. Now, I'm a very religious person, and I'm a librarian. I like to think about things through those kinds of lenses, and even I don't think of libraries as these sacred temples just because they house all these sacred tomes that must be protected at all cost. As I alluded to, when we hear the term book burning, we think of like Nazis in Germany, and if we know a little bit more about history, we might also think a bit about America as well, because it has happened here. And there are many numerous examples. Grapes of Wrath, for instance, was burned shortly after it was published, one notable example being in St. Louis, where it was burned by the St. Louis Public Library. And they did that at a time when libraries were turning a blind eye to or actively participating in segregation. Those libraries still had books in them. They were filled with books, and yet they were devoid of what makes libraries sacred. So what is it that makes libraries sacred? Now, I'm thinking about that in terms of Myst, and trying to find an answer that is short and sweet for us, for our purposes today, and that isn't, too spiritual, but also not too jargony or technical. What I kind of boiled it down to was accessible knowledge and real community, especially when those things can be paired with an active defiance against measures against those two things. Now, that's something that you care about and want to get into. I can recommend things like seeing if your library has a book sale of weeded books that you can buy to support your library. That's actually how I got my hands on my very real Myst linking book. It's not in the greatest shape. That's because it's an ex-library book. When I was very young, I would go to the library and read that book, and even if I had checked out too many books and I couldn't check out anything else, I would just go to the shelf, grab it, and just sit in the library and read. Then one day, I went to the for sale table and saw it was there. I scooped it up, and now it's mine. And it really is my linking book that links libraries and Myst for me together forever. And also, I can recommend, see if you can go to your library to find out about, or even yourself start, community activities. Follow the news to read about companies trying to restrict licensing access for ebooks, especially in libraries. Go to your library board and stick up for books that are threatened with censorship or removal from the shelf, because that is the book burning of the 21st century. Recall what I said about intent. Now, I destroy books at work when I know they're already preserved, and I do so in order to make room for more information and knowledge. Burning or censoring for the spectacle or to send a message is about making information less accessible. But also old-fashioned book burning is just not very effective, and anymore it's just not very good optics. So anymore, it's more effective to just try to make information in books less accessible. Or it's also been said that the greatest censorship is to just simply stifle the desire to read and learn. So above all, develop curiosity and a thirst for knowledge. And Myst is a great place to do that. Because think of all the sadness and tragedy surrounding the books that I've talked about in these books and libraries, especially in Uru. But despite all that, there is a vibrant present and future here for books and libraries. Just think back to everything I said earlier, if a little stretched and tongue-in-cheek, about libraries in the Myst Library being a library, talking about book collections, about public computers, spaces for collaboration, for community activities, because this really is a public library. I can't go grab those books off the shelf and read them, but there are books here I can interact with. There are spaces for collaboration. There are spaces for community activities. There are spaces just to find a community of people. I ran into this fellow at 11 o'clock at night just trying to grab screenshots, and he took the time to teach me how to wave in Uru because I'd forgotten how to do it. I couldn't do that in the public library where I work, not at 11 o'clock at night, and even if I did run into somebody at 11 o'clock at night in my library, I doubt they would know how to teach me how to wave in Uru. But here I can do it. This really is a public library in every proper sense, and it brings me so much joy to know that libraries really are in Myst just as much as Myst really is in libraries. This is the copy of Myst that the Council Bluffs Library has in its collection where I used to work. And one of the best moments of my career as a librarian was when I was able to check this out. I believe this was the first time anybody had checked it out because we just added it to the collection. And I got to check it out to this little girl who'd never played the Myst games before, and I got to provide her first experience with Myst in the context of a library. And it just felt so magical and unreal, but I had to stop and tell myself, yes, it is real. It really is happening. I just gave this child Myst in a library. Because like the hint guide at the beginning, the links between the worlds of Myst and the world of libraries are numerous and complex and layered, and they are real. Thank you. Hopefully I haven't gone super overtime if there are questions. Okay, was somebody raising? Okay, do you want to do stream questions first, or? Okay.
Yeah. So I've been thinking about libraries a lot lately, and you work at the Omaha Library. Me and my dad stopped at the Omaha Zoo on the way here, and that got me thinking that even though that while some zoos do have books, like even if the zoo didn't have a book and its information panels about the animals and the animals that live there, could a zoo be considered a library?
Well, again, if we want to think about it in a really, really broad term, like it's a collection, certainly. Usually when we're talking about libraries, we're talking about collections of resources. So I would probably not think of it like as a library, but in the sense of like it's a collection of animals, and in a sense, those animals can be, like in a really abstract sense, resources for, I don't know, people can find them relaxing, a source of mental health. They can be ways of studying biology, zoology. So I don't think it's necessarily wrong to think of it in it, like again, in a really broad sense as a library. It's something I actually hadn't thought of until you asked. So yeah, I don't know. I'm not going to say it's not a library, maybe not a conventional one, but yeah, why not?
I was just curious about the history of video games in libraries and potentially their future as being available resources for the community as pieces of art.
So it's something that I don't know a huge amount about. I can mostly go off of like what I've done personally with or experienced personally with libraries. I remember in this little tiny town in Oskaloosa where I used to live back in the mid-late 90s, they had computer games that they would let you get from the desk to take into the computer lab. I don't think you could check them out to take them home. In fact, I'm pretty sure you couldn't. So I know at least at that point there were definitely games, video games of some sort in the library. I imagine that they had been in there a little bit before that. What year? This would have been 98, 99-ish. Council Bluffs obviously they have a collection of video games that you can check out across a variety of platforms. The Omaha Public Library does not. That's the library where I currently work. I know that lots of libraries do, many don't. I couldn't really give you a real good timeline on what games have been added to libraries and when. Like I said, I can mostly just give you what I've experienced personally, which is that, yep, they are in libraries. How they're in libraries and how it works with patrons can vary from library to library. Anyone else in the room?
It's not so much a question, just a comment, I guess. But I don't know if you had ever thought that the Myst 25th anniversary edition, the big book, has all the games, the discs in it. You could almost think of that as a library as well.
You could. I'm a pretty avid book collector, and I have a whole sub-library dedicated to Myst, and it's part of that. And now I guess I could think of that as like a sub-library within a sub-library. So, yeah, why not?
Emma, to possibly get a bit pedantic, would there be a functional linguistic difference between the term library and archive?
Functionally speaking, yes. At least professionally. So we in the profession tend to distinguish between libraries and archives. Libraries have a little bit tend to, in really basic terms, libraries have a little bit more, I guess, broad functionality. It might not necessarily be a public library, but a library is meant to be something that a group of people, might be anyone in the public, it might be a small group of people working in like a tiny little museum, can pull from to, whether it's books or perhaps some other resources, whereas an archive is more focused specifically on storage and preservation. And I'm somebody who already has their MLIS. I'm just starting my master's in library science, but somebody who already has their MLIS can probably give you a way better answer than I can, but that's like kind of like a broad general idea of the distinction. Although they definitely go hand in, like my sort of minor for my program that I'm doing, I opted to study archives on top of the general library science. So it is something that if you're going to learn about archives, you're going to be doing it probably in a library science program. So they are 100% connected.
Yes. Mostly just passing along some comments from the committee on Discord. There are a lot of librarians in the group, and they really appreciate the panel. And if you aren't in the Discord, they would very much like to invite you in so you can keep talking to them about libraries.
Just the general Discord?
In the Mysterium Discord.
I'm in the Mysterium Discord. Yeah. Yes.
We're going to need to pass the microphone back and forth because otherwise they won't be able to hear the answers to their questions. So first of all, I just want to say that you're getting a lot of good engagement in the stream. There's a lot of interest, a lot of back and forth chat, so that's great. So piggybacking on one of the things you just answered a moment ago, Shadzi mentions that you've talked about the collections of books in the games as libraries, but in some cases they do seem to be meant for preservation rather than access, like the trap books in Myst 4. What libraries in the Myst universe would you consider to be more archives?
Well, something that I thought about working into the presentation, but that for time I just kind of cut, was that the word for library, at least as we see it in like the games proper, is the literal translation, I believe, is archive. So Chiso, I think, is it? Yes, the word. Yeah, that's the word that I think is often used for libraries in D'ni, but the literal translation is archive. I'm trying to think of collections of books in there that would be specifically meant for that purpose. Maybe some of the private libraries. One of the purposes of having a private library can be so that they are not just being circulated en masse to the public or widely or frequently, which can cut down on wear and tear on the books. In a sense, a private library is sort of sort of an archival project in and of itself, in a very loose sense. I'm trying to. Most of the books that you come across in the Myst universe are books that you come across because you've been able to access them as just from wandering around, which is usually not how you want an archive to work. So I can't really think of any places in Myst that, at least in terms of archive as we use it in the real world, in the library and archive kind of profession, I can't think of too many places that would fall into that category. But maybe the linking books, at least they're preserving people inside them instead of maybe the book itself. So I guess in a dark sense, you could be archiving people.
So Mr. J.M. Recalls that the D'ni civilization had a public linking book library and wondered if you ran across any information about that in your research.
Depending on which library they're talking about, if that's the Great Library, yeah, because I know the Common Library was meant to house lots and lots of linking books. And I did try my best to find whatever I could. Like I said, huge props to Larry, who's very, very helpful. And even from the knowledge that he had, it seems like we don't know that much about the Common Library. It was built by King Elesh, second King of D'ni, before he even had a temple or had a palace built for himself. We know that it was open to everyone, that it had linking books, that later the book, the Age of Kings, Book of Kings, something like that. I can't remember the exact title off the top of my head. We know that King Kedri had that added to the Common Library. That's really all I can think of off the top of my head that I know for sure about it.
And then from Cap, I'm just going to read what they said verbatim. An observation for Erik, but not really a question. When he says Veovis being beheaded in front of the library is dark and an injustice, isn't it justice from a D'ni point of view? The types of crimes he commits were of illicit age, kind of crimes against the books, and his punishment would have been done in front of books. It seems appropriately symbolic restitution.
That's a really good observation. And when I said it was injustice, I don't necessarily mean that facing consequences for his actions is an injustice. Of course, he needed to have consequences for what he did. I think what really rubbed me the wrong way the most was that his execution was going to be, if I remember correctly, something of a public spectacle, which is not something that I could really get behind. Now, in terms of it being restitution for the books themselves, I can certainly see that. I'll recall, and again, I'm bringing in like the real world of me as a librarian working with like books as we tend to think, not as because I guess if books like are sacred anywhere would be in D'ni, so I guess D'ni would be a little bit different. I specifically said that books, at least for our purposes here today, are not sacred. So I would be a little wary of setting up a justice system that has people experiencing pain, torture, death for the benefit of inanimate books. On the other hand, I value books, and so could his whatever would happen to him be done inside a library? Maybe not as a public spectacle. Maybe as Tiana intervened and had him sent to a prison age. I'm sure there's a way that I don't know if they actually had him go enter the age inside a library. It's been a little while since I read that whole portion of the book, so I don't know. But at the very least, really interesting observation that is definitely getting the wheels turning a little bit. Any others?
I think we can go back to
Okay.
After thousands of years of material science, the D'ni seem to have developed books that don't care about being left in the sun or in humid rooms or in the rain or being dropped out of the sky or being manhandled by machinery. If libraries didn't have to worry about the physical preservation of books anymore, how do you think they would have evolved differently?
That's also something that I thought about trying to work into the presentation, because one of the first things when I went back for the Book of D'ni. This linking book to Tirani probably has to be God knows how many thousands of years old, and possibly the oldest book encountered in the Myst universe, at least on our end. And so I was wondering, how is this book still even here, let alone with enough functionality in, I don't know, if it's the ink or the pages to be a functional link. So I don't know. If you really want to think about it in like nitty-gritty physics or science, I imagine it probably could have affected how they evolved as a society, having the ability to create books that are more or less, at least as best as we can tell, indestructible. At least impervious to just time and the elements. If they weren't able to accomplish that, I imagine there probably would be a lot more rewriting of ages. There'd probably be a much bigger access on archives that are just not accessible at all, that are focused purely on preservation, which, as I noted, we don't really see, at least not that we can really access. So maybe the reason why we can't access them is because they didn't really worry about it so much. Yeah.
You mentioned you weren't sure what you'd call the return of the red and blue books in Revelation a library or not. Obviously, it's the equivalent of the restricted section from Hogwarts Library. And one thing I always found, I mean, it's deliberate, everybody understands it, is that Myst is basically at its core an allegory for falling into a good book. And it's quite literally there from the very beginning with the falling man and the visual description, and Atris literally falling into the fissure and falling into the book as he does so. How deeply does that speak to you as someone who deals with libraries and books on a regular basis, that this entire series basically at its core is basically saying, even though it is new media, even though it is computer, even though it is technology that'll wear out in 5 years and have to be rebuilt again and again and again, it's still saying this old stuff that we've had for hundreds and thousands of years is still worthwhile and still worth preserving and still worth enjoying and participating and interacting with?
I think maybe the best way I can answer that is by saying you basically just gave my presentation with all the thoughts that were in my head, just in a much more like really deep and personal and subjective, or I don't know, emotional in a good sense. You basically just gave me my presentation back to me. So there's your answer. Okay. Just leave this back at the podium.
If you have anything you want to say to wrap up?
Read books, play Myst. Oh,